The first half of Ozark's fourth and final season has come and gone and left us dangling from a rocky cliff with many questions, no answers, and no confirmed date as of yet for the show's final chapter. Part 1 of Season 4, just like Season 3, ended on a very powerful note that left our knuckles completely white. Ozark is one of the better ongoing shows out there, in my opinion. From what we've seen from the showrunners and what we've come to expect from them, I have little doubt that the show will end well. But in my opinion, it will require a Herculean effort of sorts for the creators, cast, and crew to end the show in a way that catapults Ozark into the prestigious S tier of TV shows, where shows like The Sopranos and Breaking Bad safely reside. That's not meant to be a knock on Ozarks. Ozark is finely crafted television. It's inventive, thrilling, and surprising. It has characters you can connect with and has great performances and production value. The show succeeds especially at establishing an air of unpredictability, creating the kind of dread that keeps you posted at the edge of your seat even during its more mundane sequences. And admirably, the show is not overstaying its welcome. But despite all that the show does well, I don't view Ozark as being one of the few revolutionary shows with the power to drastically alter the course of television. Part of the appeal of the show, in my view, is that it's not trying to be that. I see Ozark, however, as another step forward in the dramatic evolution of television as a medium of storytelling, paying the influences from past shows forward and refreshing their storytelling tactics to further the evolution of the medium as a whole. Ozark follows in the tradition of the shows that paved the way for its existence through the morally gray nature of the characters. To track how the showrunners deviate from that tradition, we should compare and contrast it with one of its influences, and in my view, the most apt comparison we can make is with AMC's Breaking Bad. Comparisons between these two shows are made frequently and center around the similar criminal aspects of both shows: the drug trafficking, the cartel, and the money laundering. The most apparent contrasts between Walter White and Marty Byrde are the fields in which their skills reside and their level of intention. Walt makes the choice to enter the meth game willingly, and he does it ultimately for money, power, and respect. Being the one who knocks made Walt feel alive. Whereas Marty, blindsided by the true implications of his cartel ties, is woken up from his naivete and has to scramble at gunpoint for the opportunity to buy time for his family, even if it means furthering his indebtedness to the cartel. Another key difference between Walt and Marty is the involvement of their families in their criminal endeavors. For the majority of Breaking Bad, Walt has to keep his crystal meth empire under wraps. Being shielded from the criminal underbelly Walt participates in, Skyler and Walt Jr.'s characters remain more or less stagnant and serve primarily as a juxtaposition to Walt to highlight just how drastically he's changed over the seasons. Marty's family did not, however, have the luxury of blissful ignorance. The Byrdes were thrown into the deep end immediately and forced to swim. As a result of the sword constantly hanging over their heads, the Byrde family had to evolve, becoming craftier and more resourceful. In their short time in the Ozarks, Charlotte becomes a reliable lieutenant in the Byrde family operation, and Jonah sets up a sophisticated money laundering system at the age of just 14. Showing the adaptation of the Byrde kids is just one of the ways the showrunners enrich the depth of their entire cast of characters. Another way they do this is by giving their more villainous and morally reprehensible characters justifiable motivations. The primary source of antagonism for the Byrdes is very clear. They're staring down the barrel of Navarro's gun. But the cartel kingpin isn't fully detached from humanity in the way that villains like Tuco or Gus Fring might be. Navarro is motivated greatly by the future of his children and is even willing to work with the FBI towards that end. Other candidates for the villain position, characters like Darlene and Helen Pierce, are also motivated by the need to protect their family, particularly their children, humanizing otherwise heinous characters. Considering the depth of Ozark's characters and the uniform moral grayness, it can become difficult to differentiate the good guys from the bad guys. That is until we meet Navarro's ambitious nephew, Javi. Javi doesn't concern himself with family or with finding justifications for the casual way he commits violence. Javi is the logical answer to the question of who is the real villain on Ozark. But he's also an easy answer, and he fails to account for the source of the show's villainy in the 3 prior seasons. For that reason, I want to explore a different angle, one that sees Wendy Bird as Ozark's primary villain. Fitting Wendy into the villain category may seem like a tough sell to some, but may be an obvious connection to others. Just like Navarro, she's driven by the primal need to protect her children and her family. But like her children, Wendy evolves over the course of the show. She becomes more resourceful, yet grows increasingly more ruthless. As the stakes escalate throughout the seasons, Wendy is forced to take increasingly callous actions. She has to lie, cheat, blackmail, and bribe in order to accomplish her goals, and when the welfare of her children is put into jeopardy, no option is off the table, not even murder. Wendy's decision to give up her mentally unstable brother Ben and allow him to be murdered was perhaps the most shocking moment of the show thus far. On the face of the circumstances, it certainly reinforces the notion of Wendy as a villain. But Wendy has something of a moral alibi. She allowed Ben to fall into the arms of the cartel because his instability posed a dire threat to the entire Bird family. She did what she did, in other words, for her family, and paid an emotional price for it, a weekend cooped up in her car with a bottle of vodka. Wendy's decision to give up her brother for the good of her nuclear family isn't going to be scoring her any morality points, but considering the potential consequences of opting for an alternative option, I'm hesitant to label what she did as evil. What I'm much less hesitant to label as evil are the ways in which Wendy leverages Ben's death in her quest for power. Since Wendy's background is in politics, we could call her converting her brother's disappearance into a sob story to raise funds for her foundation instinctual. But regardless, it marks an all-time low for Wendy. Lying about the true nature of her brother's demise could have been Wendy's idea of a coping mechanism, and using his death to her and her family's advantage might have just been seen by her as good political hygiene. After all, as they say in the world of politics, you never let a good crisis go to waste. Regardless of any elaborate rationalizations, the way Wendy handled her brother's memory shines a spotlight on one of her most prominent objectives. An objective that may eventually come into conflict with the need to protect her family, and that is Wendy's thirst for power. That thirst is evident in the show's latter seasons when Wendy grows closer to Navarro and establishes the Bird family foundation. It is Wendy who mobilizes her political acumen to get their casino deals through. When Marty considers cutting his cartel ties to go on the run, it is Wendy who further entrenches the family into their new life of crime with a pitch on expansion into legitimate enterprises. The Wendy of later seasons is drastically different from the Wendy we met in the first episode, but in her anglings for power, she shows a trait that she's had all along: an unusually high risk tolerance. We see it in the first episode when she tries to run away from the cartel with her lover and the money from her and Marty's joint bank account. Going back even further to the inception of Marty's collaboration with the cartel, it is Wendy who accepts the idea of her husband laundering drug money. Even as a teenager, Wendy would break into other people's houses and desecrate their inner sanctums. Out of all the characters on Ozark, Wendy is among the most quotable, and there are a number of her quotes that offer us an insight into her character. The quote that sticks out to me the most comes towards the end of Season 3, when she's on the run with her brother. During a conversation, Ben inquires into the origins of her sister's criminal career. Reminiscing on the past few years, Wendy admits, quote, "Fighting for your life makes every other thing you ever did before seem extremely dull." Wendy and Marty's marriage is on the rocks when we first meet them. With the benefit of foresight, we can easily see how Wendy languished living under the monotonous trance of the typical suburban life. There was no sense of danger, no crisis to exploit, and no real risks to take. By all conventional measures, she had it all, but the comforts of a material life left her empty and drove her into an affair and away from her family. In the Season 3 premiere, just as the Bird family may be closing in on an exit from the Ozarks, Wendy's thirst for power ratchets up. She bemoans the insignificant matters she's tasked with, and, as if uncomfortable with a couple inches of breathing room, pitches Marty on making themselves a more valuable asset to Navarro by securing additional legitimate revenue streams for his children. Marty hates the idea of deepening their cartel ties, but Wendy views the expansion as necessary to insulating the family from immediate danger, but also, and perhaps more importantly, as a hedge against the dullness of a totally safe life. Marty wants to wiggle out of the cartel's grip as soon as possible, and Wendy wants to keep her wings spread and avoid being caged up again, even if it means keeping the crosshairs of danger aimed at Jonah and Charlotte. It's at this point that the question is raised. Does Wendy's thirst for power trump her need to protect her family? Or has she fallen victim to the hubris of believing that she can balance both evenly? The ideological difference between Marty and Wendy leads to a sort of cold civil war ensuing within the family, one that Wendy gets the upper hand in by courting Helen Pierce and Navarro behind her husband's back. At the end of the Season 3 premiere, Wendy returns to Chicago to meet Navarro for the first time. She allows herself a satisfied smile upon winning the drug lord over to her scheme. Then she does something interesting. Wendy revisits the family's old home and breaks in, the same way she did as a teenager. She enters the son's room and makes the bed, making the audience think for a split second that she may be rethinking her risk-taking ways, before messing up the house with great relish, as if she were burning the remnants of that past life of dull comfort in favor of her new life of crime. Sitting down on the freshly made bed, she could hardly stop herself from giving in to the urge of ransacking the house, suggesting an addictive kind of thrill or rush from acts with risk attached to them. Obviously, in that scene, the main risk was the risk of getting caught in the act, but I interpreted the scene as being symbolic for the new matrix of risk she embarked upon being with Navarro. Connecting the risky acts Wendy committed as a disaffected teen with the risk of working with the cartel implies that her character hasn't changed fundamentally, but rather the move to the Ozarks and the crushing burden of living in constant danger offered her the space to grow into who she really is, a conniving yet resourceful person who is driven to transcend the humble means she was born into and is more than willing to go all in to accomplish that. The question that remains is, how does that make her a villain? If anything, her motivation humanizes her in the eyes of many. In an interview with GQ, Laura Linney, the actress who portrays Wendy, is posed with a similar question about her character's villain status. Linney responds by saying, quote, "I don't know if she is a villain because she's not trying to hurt her family. She's trying to save her family. I think if she were actively, intentionally trying to derail her family, then she would be a real villain." Besides her culpability in her brother's death, I think this is a fair answer. I don't think Wendy is intentionally trying to derail her family, but considering her affinity for risk-taking and her lust for power, she unconsciously acts in a way that keeps her family under the constant threat of danger. If we wanted to build an argument for Wendy as the villain, we should look towards some of the questionable decisions she makes in Season 4. Firstly, she derails her family's integrity by embellishing Ben's drug problem and disappearance. But seeing as their integrity was never on firm footing to begin with, the most egregious Wendy gets during the season is trying to get Jonah sent to jail for laundering Darlene's drug money. Wendy is willing to send her own son to jail because his new allegiance to Darlene undermines her own power. She tries to unite her family by purging the bad, rebellious apple. Ultimately, I don't view Wendy as the show's villain, at least thus far. As Navarro tells Marty in the first episode, the greatest threat will always come from the inside. Wendy and Marty have had their differences in the past, and as their true aspirations continue to conflict, it's possible Wendy's thirst for power will consume her, and she will seize the reins of being the show's villain. It's even possible that the end of Darlene and Jacob's relationship could foreshadow the end of the series. But for now, I'm not entirely bullish on the idea of Wendy as the show's villain. I think a more accurate title for her would be Anti-Heroine, and she may be one of the best in television history. Wendy Bird's character marks an evolution in the archetype of the criminal's wife. Instead of being a passive bystander to criminal activity or being the moral compass pointing her villainous husband towards the path of righteousness, Wendy is an essential partner in the family's criminal endeavors. She is ruthless. She's conniving. She's very good at what she does, and she does not shy away from going beyond Marty's back if she believes it's in the interests of her family. To circle back to the Breaking Bad comparison, Wendy is more like Walt than she is like Skyler. She feeds off the rush of danger, makes her feel good, and her prowess and accumulation of power swells her up with pride. Returning to that old life of routine dullness is unthinkable to her. Just like Walt, Wendy has the best interests of her family in mind, but ultimately, she does it for herself.